This is Fitch's Structured Finance in Focus. Straightforward insight without the noise.
Hello, and welcome to the latest edition of Structured Finance in Focus. My name is Kendra, and I manage the U.S. RMBS group. I'm joined today with Ryan O'Loughlin, who's a team leader and a senior director in the group. Today, we're going to talk about alternative credit scores. So let's go ahead and get started. Classic FICO has actually been the standard in the mortgage market for the better part of 3 decades. In 2018, legislation was passed that directed the FHFA to approve new alternative credit scores for use with the GSEs. In 2022, they approved VantageScore 4.0 and FICO 10T. And since then, the GSEs have released tens of millions of records to allow the market to actually compare the VantageScore to the classic FICOs. But if this has really been a GSE issue, I guess the first question is, Ryan, why does this matter to the private label securitization market?
Sure thing. Thanks, Kevin, for having me. If you're thinking about agency origination, they can wind up either sold directly to the GSEs, they could remain on the portfolio of the different entities that are originating them, or they could ultimately be sold into private label securitizations. So a lot of these originators have already started building out and thinking about, systems to help them underwrite these loans for delivery to the GSEs. And now they're starting to think more broadly about, what execution might look like if they're ultimately sold into the non-agency space.
Okay, so why are people hesitant to introduce these new scores into the RMBS market?
Sure. So the biggest challenge is really going to be just performance through an actual credit cycle or observable performance through, somewhat of a downturn. Market participants in the PLS space have pretty sophisticated models that have been built and developed over, millions and millions of records that have utilized and taken into account loans that were underwritten to classic FICO, while the GSEs on the other side of things, they have in-house models that they have built themselves off of the full credit files, and they're really only using these alternatives credit scores and even classic FICO today for loan level adjustments. So they're in a little bit of a better place to transition and to accept these alternative scores versus other market participants that have been using them more directly for actual risk management.
Okay, so the GSEs are really using these for pricing initiatives, but presumably these newer algorithms and scores are providing better default predictors. So what are the challenges of using these new scores in the U.S. RMBS modeling framework?
Sure. So Fitch's origination PD model uses classic FICO currently as one of the 14 variables, and it's highly predictive. That analysis or the underlying data that kind of feeds into the regression was based on millions of records going back to the early to the mid-1990s through the mid-2010s. Some of these alternative credit scores are actually built to the alternative credit scores. If you're looking at either VantageScore or FICO 10T, aren't really applicable to just swap in directly and kind of replace classic FICO. They utilize completely different algorithms. They're based on different data sources. So it's going to be pretty challenging to just use those directly into our model or through kind of the classic FICO variable, or even to take into account some type of mapping.
Please tell me you have a plan. How do you expect Fitch to actually address this issue?
Sure. So our model does take into account loans that have a missing FICO score through kind of a missing FICO adjustment. One thing that we're currently considering or looking into is if we did see loans that were underwritten to one of these alternative scores, to essentially treat those as having a missing FICO to better differentiate some of the expected outcomes and to take into account loans that have higher ranges versus some of the lower ranges. We would then make different PD adjustments off of that kind of base output that assume the missing score.
And where does Fitch stand on the overall process?
Sure thing. So Fitch is currently comfortable if it was to see or be shown transactions or portfolios that have up to 10% of the loans that were originated or underwritten to some of these alternative credit scores. If you're thinking more broadly or more down the line, we're currently working on and formalizing a more longer-term solution for handling loans with these attributes. We're hoping to present that internally sometime in the third quarter, and then either late fourth quarter or early first quarter, we're hoping to put out an updated criteria framework or a request for comment.
Well, it sounds like that takes care of the modeling aspect. Is that the only thing to worry about with relating to these credit scores?
Not entirely. There's still the topics of lender choice and disclosure.
So what do you mean by lender choice?
Sure. So lender choice really boils down to the different optionality that the originators have when they're underwriting the loan. If you think about today's environment, it's pretty standardized where almost all originations utilize classic FICO and the loans are underwritten to a tri-merge. So a tri-merge is just 3 different credit scores that are pulled, and it would include scores from TransUnion, Equifax, and Experian. If we're thinking about where this might ultimately move to when some of these alternative scores are accepted and utilized more broadly, the number of options just really starts to increase pretty substantially. So now in this environment, you could have certain loans that are originated using classic FICO, you could have some that are originated using Vantage Score, and you could have some that are originated using FICO 10T. And then with that, you have the additional complexity in how many scores are actually pulled. Would these originations continue to use a tri-merge? Would some of the originators switch to only pulling 2 scores? Or could you have a situation where only a single credit score is being pulled?
Certainly seems like there's an opportunity for selection bias.
Absolutely. And one of the areas we're really focusing on there is how there would actually be, selecting which model or which algorithm they ultimately might want to choose. Certain originators may always select just a certain credit model. Others may select it more on an ad hoc basis based on certain loan attributes, or you could have a situation where others are really selecting it based on which is the most favorable terms for the borrower.
Yeah, I certainly think you're going to see all of the above. So what do you mean by disclosure?
So disclosure is really focusing on making sure that, market participants have the same amount of information that, the originators had when they're actually looking at the loan. So as I mentioned previously, there's a number of different options that are now available. Again, some originators may choose to pull, multiple credit scores when they're underwriting the loan, and then ultimately base the underwriting decision on just one loan or some combination of them. With that, the amount of information on the credit score that's actually released to the market, whether it may be investors or rating agencies, would typically be focused more on the actual score that we use to underwrite the loan. And then that can leave a pretty meaningful difference or somewhat of an incomplete picture for only focusing on that score, as opposed to what some of these other models were, suggesting the credit risk of that borrower was. So to eliminate or hopefully mitigate some of this bias and just the additional risks associated with that, it's really just focusing on and thinking through just the actual amount of information on the different scores that is available. In an ideal situation, all the various scores that were initially pulled, whether or not they were actually used to underwrite the loan, would be made available. And in those instances where, more of a select amount of the information or a more limited number of the scores are actually provided versus what was originally pulled, those instances do have a little bit more bias, and we may have to introduce additional PD adjustments.
Thank you, Ryan, for your insights. And thank you for listening. If you want more information on U.S. RMBS or alternative credit scores, please visit us at our website, fitchratings.com. And don't forget to subscribe to your podcast on Apple or Spotify.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Fitch's Structured Finance in Focus. For more episodes, subscribe on Spotify and Apple.